Thank you so much for joining us today for today's discussion on what's next for California's clean water laws. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Melissa Thorm is a partner with Downey Brand for over 30 years. Melissa has assisted industrial and municipal clients in resolving environmental compliance issues and negotiating or litigating their regulatory enforcement actions. Please give a big welcome. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, everyone. We have asked people that are just joining to put their names and where they're from in the chat so everyone can see who all is on board. I recognize quite a few of those names. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. And we are going to start with a little history because today we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, which was an act that galvanized the nation around clean water and garnered an override of a presidential veto. So this all came about, mostly the stories are from the Cuyahoga River, which burned 13 times. This is one of the photos that was shared by Northeast Ohio Regional, SAM, showing that it was on fire. And with the next photo, you can see how lovely that water was. It just made you want to jump in and swim because that was certainly pretty back then. But because of the Clean Water Act, we've made quite a huge strides in water quality. This is now the riverside of that river. So it looks quite nice. And we believe that it's now meeting the fishable, swimmable goals of the Clean Water Act. And that is quite a big change over 50 years. And so we should tap ourselves on the back and say we're proud of all the work that we've done to accomplish this. More close to home, this is a photo from Berkeley showing what it looked like back in the day, not looking quite so pretty. 1941, when this was long before there was treatment plants and requirements for secondary or even tertiary treatment. So the water was not looking very pristine in Berkeley, where there was sewage directly being discharged into the bay along with industrial waste. And now we have waterways that are clean enough for people to swim in. People often swim to Alcatraz Island, which I think they're crazy people, but that's mostly because it's cold, not because of water quality. As you can see, people wearing wetsuits to swim in that water. But here we are today, and we are going to now introduce our panelists. So we have some great folks on board today. So first up will be Nicole Morgan, and she was appointed as the civil engineer member to the State Water Resources Control Board by Governor Newsom in June of 2021. So she's a newbie on our board, and we welcome her. She most recently served as the Assistant Deputy Director to the Water Board's Division of Financial Assistance, where she worked on projects providing funding for drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and groundwater infrastructure improvements. And we thank her for all that money that she gave to us to make great strides. During this time, Ms. Morgan also managed a variety of additional programs, including the lead in child care centers, fish advisories, and drinking water and wastewater operation certification programs. Next up, we have Adam Link, who is the Executive Director of the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, CASA, and he brings over 10 years of experience dealing with wastewater regulatory, legislative, and legal issues to managing the association and ensuring that CASA fulfills its mission of providing trusted information and advocacy on behalf of California Clean Water agencies. Prior to joining CASA, Adam was a practicing attorney focusing on water quality, environmental, and local government issues. And he holds degrees from the University of California, Santa Barbara and University of Pacific McGeorge School of Law. Next, we have Dave Owens, who is a professor of law and faculty director of scholarly publications for UC Hastings. He teaches courses in environmental, water, land use, energy, and administrative law. He went to Berkeley Law, where he served as editor-in-chief of Ecology Law Quarterly and was selected for Order of the Coif. He went on to clerk at a federal district court and worked for a small law firm in San Francisco, where his practice focused primarily on water law. He worked on Colorado River allocation, Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta litigation, and federal and state disputes over proposed Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. And last but not least, we have my partner, Nicole Granquist from Downey Brand. She's also the chair of the Natural Resources Department and is among an elite group of attorneys whose practice is devoted entirely to water quality, regulatory compliance, enforcement, defense, and litigation. Given Nicole's extensive knowledge of the complex regulatory schemes created by the Federal Clean Water Act, California Porter-Cologne Water Quality Act, she's frequently retained to defend public and private entities against third-party citizen suits filed by Baykeeper, Sierra Club, NRDC, California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance, California River Watch, and other similar groups in federal court, and has successfully litigated or resolved over 50 cases in the last 15 years involving wastewater, processed water, and stormwater discharges. So we will start off with our presentation from Nicole Morgan. Welcome, Nicole.
Good morning and thank you. So I'm happy to be able to join everyone this morning, virtual celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. The act was enacted on October 18, 1972 in response to a flood of litigation. Sweeping amendments were made to the Federal Pollution Control Act of 1948, which were largely based on California's 1969 Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act. Under the Federal Clean Water Act, the state's pioneering Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act, the State Water Resources Control Board, also known as the State Water Boards, and the 9 regional water quality control boards have regulatory responsibility for protecting the water quality of nearly 1.6 million acres of lakes, 1.3 million acres of bays and estuaries, 211,000 miles of rivers and streams, and about 1,100 miles of exquisite California coastline. 50 years ago, large state and federal investments were made to make improvements to our wastewater infrastructure. Many of our regional facilities throughout California were built using these investments. The enactment of the Clean Water Act brought a new era of sanitation and water stewardship, enabling the water board to take a proactive step to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of California's water resources and drinking water for the protection of the environment, public health, and all beneficial uses to ensure proper water resource allocation and efficient use for the benefit in present and future generations. As we stand here today, looking back over the past 50 years, we can be proud of how far we've come. In addition to empowering environmental protection through regulation, we've been able to start building resiliency. Since the Clean Water State Revolving Fund was established in 1989, the fund has provided California with more than $14 billion to finance the protection and improvement of water quality in over 400 unique communities. This past year, the state legislature also committed $1.3 billion to the clean water and drinking water infrastructure projects, $200 million for groundwater and recycled water projects, $100 million for PFAS, and $10 million for emergency drought projects. Our climate has changed, and the West continues to get hotter and drier. As it does, we will see on average less snowfall, more evaporation, and greater consumption of water by vegetation, soil, and the atmosphere itself. DWR estimates that 10% estimates a 10% reduction in water supply by 2040, and is planning a scenario that considers increased temperatures and decreased runoff due to thirstier plants, soils, and atmosphere. As we look forward, we will need to collaborate to confront climate change and build resiliency. As climate change is changing the way we use water in California, conservation is becoming a way of life. This brings new challenges, such as decreased flows in our collection systems, increased concentrations entering our wastewater treatment facilities, and the need to change the way we operate and maintain our facilities. This will increase the need to work together, not just to understand these challenges, but to develop a plan forward. In July, next slide, please. In July, the State Water Board staff provided an update on the recycled water policy. The goals of the policy are to increase the amount of recycled water used, maximize reuse where groundwater supplies are in a state of overdraft, and reuse all dry weather discharge to enclosed bays, estuaries, coastal lagoons, ocean waters as feasible. Goals are important. They measure progress and drive change. When looking to reevaluate goals in the next amendment of the recycled water policy, we need feasible as well as aspirational goals to feel like we're making progress and also drive investments at a large scale. There is no easy answer to what the goals should be, and it will be a tough evaluation that should not just focus on a number, but rather reflect the current state of California's water landscape and take a holistic approach that acknowledges conservation, decreasing wastewater flows, and the state's increasing aridification due to climate change. This past June, the State Water Board adopted a resolution authorizing the executive director to enter into an agreement with UCLA, the Sacramento State Office of Water Programs, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the California Institute for Water Resources. The wastewater needs assessment will support our statewide effort to assess wastewater needs to improve sanitation access to all Californians and help achieve the human rights water goals. Currently, we do not have a statewide risk framework to prioritize project support from staff and to assist communities in obtaining available funding to resolve a failing or inadequate system. The concepts of the needs assessment include human right to sanitation and identifying at-risk communities, wastewater system risk and compliance issues, public collaboration and wastewater data needs, system solutions, funding, and affordability. The first phase includes baseline assessment that is scheduled to begin in July of 2023. The second phase is planned to start in July of 2025 and anticipated to include data mapping and system rating, solutions, and affordability. We anticipate concluding the assessment in June of 2027. So I'm assuming many of you have seen this slide at some point over the past few months, summarizing the estimated grant allotments from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. In the end, $210 million was appropriated for any eligible project for federal fiscal year 2022 versus the estimated $301 million. This provided for a total of $216.7 million. This provides a different outlook on future lending capacity of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Therefore, the fundable list adopted at this past Monday's board meeting represents a 2-year loan capacity. Therefore, the Deputy Director for the Division of Financial Assistance has been asked to evaluate impacts on future years lending, impacts on rising construction costs on executed agreements, effects on past and current lending on long-term loan capacity, effects on past current lending on short-term cash flow, and needs for modifications to this year's IUP based on advice from the financial advisor. As we move forward, board staff will be working with stakeholders to ensure transparency and collaboration. In addition to the federal funding, last fiscal year, we also received additional state funding. And so there was an additional 650 for wastewater, 650 million for wastewater. As previously stated, the groundwater and recycle fundings. There's also 20 million for US and Mexico border projects. And there's also the wastewater and drinking water arrearages programs, which have concluded. So California's water supply strategy. The strategy prioritizes actions to capture, recycle, and conserve more water. These actions include creating space to store up to 4 million acre-feet of water, improving our ability to capitalize on big storms when they occur, and store water for later, recycling and reusing at least 800,000 acre-feet of water per year by 2030, freeing up 500,000 acre-feet of water for new purposes each year by embracing the one water concept, making new water available for use by capturing stormwater and desalinating ocean water and brackish water in groundwater basins, diversifying supplies and making the most of high flows during storm events. To deliver projects at a pace and scale necessary, we need to work with the legislature and stakeholders to modernize regulatory structures, create an expedited permitting path, expand staff capacity, sharpen and evaluate interagency coordination, create funding that incentivizes water users to develop regional targets for recycling, for storage, efficiency, and other water management storage strategies. These targeted actions aim to secure supplies for people so that homes, schools, and businesses do not suffer disruptions, and the state's agricultural economy continues to thrive. To make all this happen, collaboration will be key. It will be key for us to continue to work with our stakeholders and as we move forward and build a resilient future for California. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. That was great. We are next going to move on to Adam Link, who's going to give his presentation. He had a little internet problems, but he's been running. And I put in the chat that if anybody has questions, please put them in the question and answer. There's a little tool down at the bottom of your screen, Q&A, and if you have questions, stick them in there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Yeah, sorry about that. I missed the intro, but I got to see most of Nicole's presentation, so thanks very much. My name is Adam Link. I'm the Executive Director of the California Association of Sanitation Agencies, CASA, and for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we represent about 125 public agencies engaged in collection, treatment, and disposal of wastewater and the development of renewable resources like bioenergy, biosolids, and recycled water. I myself am a recovering attorney, so I love being on a panel with other attorneys and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk to you all. I wanted to cover at a pretty high level the past, present, and the future of the Clean Water Act, which is pretty ambitious for about 15 minutes that I've been assigned, but I hope we can kind of make it through at least at a high level. So yeah, next slide. Thanks, Alec. So for the past, I don't want to cover this in too much depth because I think Nicole did a pretty good job of describing some of the things that have been accomplished under the last 50 years of the Clean Water Act. And, you know, it's an understatement to say the progress in water quality has been really tremendous. But I do want to reemphasize, and, you know, I think Nicole covered this with the financing element, but probably the single most important contribution of the Clean Water Act has been that massive influx of funding on a large scale infrastructure projects at clean water agencies. This sort of initial
Okay, we have a problem. Adam froze. I don't know that you can still hear me, Adam, but if you could call in maybe to keep moving forward. Sorry, everyone. Technical difficulties always occur. If anyone has any questions for anyone while we're waiting for Adam to click back in, please put them in the chat and we can deal with those. All right, looks like he just signed off and hopefully we'll fall right in. No one has any questions. It's very shocking for the people that I know online. Normally have a lot of questions. Okay, so we have a question. One of the slides toward the end noted a goal of expanding ocean desalinization. Will the state board be able to influence the Coastal Commission on a broader view of coastal sited plants? For Nicole Morgan. Are you there, Nicole?
I'm here. Just
Okay.
reading through the question there. So
Yeah.
thank you for the question. I'm not so sure we'll be able to influence, the Coastal Commission. We have several charges. Just moving forward, what we really want to do is really look at that streamlined approach, or really working together across the different organizations. And so that when a project comes to, whether it's coming to the water board for permitting or it's going to the Coastal Commission, we have aligned those priorities for each agency so that we are aware of what those priorities are, and we're taking those into consideration as we're developing that project. So really working together from the beginning, making sure that we're identifying projects that align with each agency, and having effective communication and being transparent of what each of us are looking for, and making sure that we are eliminating perhaps those, as you enter, one agency wants one thing, another agency wants another, but eliminating those type of regulatory roadblocks where we are really coming together to move projects forward.
Thank you. So we are going to switch over to Dave Owen's presentation. Sorry for this, but I haven't seen Adam sign back on. So we're going to move to that if we could, Alec.
You bet. Dave is ready.
Yeah.
Dave.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. It's the morning of technical difficulties. Let me just get the slideshow started here. Okay, so first of all, thank you everybody for being here today, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. And I apologize, I taught until about 7 minutes ago this morning, and so I've missed some of the earlier discussion, but I'm glad to be joining you now. I am going to talk about a research project, and it's a research project that is about some cutting edge steps in water quality regulation, both under the Clean Water Act and also under California's Porter-Cologne law. And I think that the presentation is a little bit responsive to the other question that just popped up in the chat about where we are with the Clean Water Act and whether we are on track to achieve the basic goals of making our waterways fishable and swimmable. I think the short answer to that question is no right now. And here's why. The brief report card, and I think Adam would probably go into this in more depth if he's able to finish out his talk, is that the statute has been really effective at controlling industrial and wastewater plant effluent. There's still obviously more work to do here, but so much of the really significant gains that have come from the Clean Water Act have come there. It has been less effective at managing urban and industrial stormwater. We've made some gains, but those are still very significant challenges, and they require a lot of legal work and technical work as well. And the statute as a whole has been really ineffective at dealing with agricultural sources. And so the reason so many waterways are impaired and that we are so far from achieving those basic goals, well, there are many reasons, but the biggest reason remains ag, which remains the largest source of water quality impairment across the nation. So as a threshold matter, I know that a lot of people on this call are part of or work with traditional NPDES regulated point sources, particularly wastewater treatment plants or other similar facilities. That's not what this talk is going to be about. So let me initially try to sell you on why you should still care and pay attention for the next 13 minutes. And here's the basic explanation. The Clean Water Act calls for water quality standards, and then it calls for NPDES permits to be stringent enough to attain compliance with those water quality standards. And if you have a situation, which we do in many states, where there's strict regulation of NPDES permitted sources, at least the non-stormwater sources, and not much control of non-point source pollution, that means the burden of meeting water quality standards falls primarily on the point sources. In other words, less effective regulation of non-point sources can lead to higher regulatory burdens and higher compliance costs for point sources. It can also lead to much, much higher costs for society as a whole, because right now the potential for cost-effective gains in water quality from regulating non-point sources is so much higher than it is with piling some additional regulatory requirements on top of point sources. And so the real gains that we could achieve are typically in the non-point source sector, or the cheapest gains. All right, but we haven't really done it. And why not? There are a couple of reasons that flow back to the language of the Clean Water Act itself. As I think probably most of you know, the statute excludes agricultural stormwater runoff and return flows from irrigated agriculture from the definition of point source. That means they're outside of the NPDES permitting program, which again is really the most effective part of the statute. Regulating non-point sources has largely instead been left up to state discretion, and many states have used that discretion to do pretty much nothing, or at least to do very little with non-point sources. And so the question that drove this study that I did was how things might be different. And there are some pretty well-known case studies of places where things are different. So here you see Chesapeake Bay on the left, Lake Champlain in Vermont and New York on the right. These are both areas where there have been ambitious efforts to regulate non-point source pollution, primarily through TMDLs. And seems to be some real accomplishments, even though, again, there's lots and lots of work left to do. But what I was interested in is trying to find if there are places where more comprehensive efforts, and efforts that aren't just keyed to one specific water body, are underway. And so that took me to California, and then more specifically for the research I was doing, to the North Coast region. So here you see the different regional water boards for California. The focus for this research was on Region 1. It's not the only region where there are ambitious efforts at non-point source regulation taking place. It's just the one I happen to focus on for this study. So just a little bit about the region. The governing water quality regulatory bodies are the State Water Board and then the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. Here's a map of the region, and you can see it's large. For those of you who know this area, it's also very sparsely populated. It is also one of California's wettest regions, or is California's wettest region, although that precipitation is almost entirely in the winter months. So it has the same Mediterranean climate patterns we see elsewhere in the state. And also, and this is actually kind of important, and the photos here don't fully do it justice, it is a mind-bogglingly beautiful place. And that does matter when you're going to ask people to take steps to protect resources. If the resource itself is charismatic, is inspiring, it makes a difference. It's a heavily forested region, both national forests and private forests. And again, that matters for water quality, because forests you could think of as high water quality machines. They're very good if they're left intact at producing good water quality. But it's also a steep and very erosive region, which makes sediment a significant challenge. Historically, there were lots and lots of fish, particularly salmonids, in the streams of these regions, and they are still the primary drivers for water quality standards. But many parts of this region were heavily logged over the years. So here you see a comparison showing levels of logging in the mid-20th century in the Garcia River watershed. This chart shows logging levels over the region as a whole, and you can see that they're declining over time, but still there's lots and lots of logging that took place, and a lot of it took place prior to the 1970s, so before we had any sort of significant environmental protection. We're still feeling the legacy effects of a lot of those activities today, as well as the impacts of present practices. It is also an agricultural region. Most of it is too steep for agriculture, so a lot of it is forested, but in pockets, particularly in the southern part of the area, but also throughout. There are agricultural land uses, and of course, the biggest agricultural land use in the area is growing mind-altering substances, as we can see here. So quickly, what's the legal framework for dealing with non-point source pollution in this area? You have the Clean Water Act, which prohibits most unpermitted point source discharges, establishes planning programs for non-point source controls. California's Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act is also important here because it has prohibitions on waste discharges and then exemptions to those prohibitions that function a little bit like general and specific permits with prohibitions and associated waivers. And here, just quickly about the waivers, those have to be consistent with overall water quality control plans the last 5 years. So the terminology is different, but it is basically a permitting program. So what I was looking at is the range of different programs that the North Coast Board has established. And the main point of this slide is that it is really a broad range. You have some form of regulatory coverage for non-point source programs for almost the full range, either existing or in development and soon to come, for almost the full range of activities that lead to significant amounts of non-point source pollution in the region. And I'm not going to give you detailed summaries of all of the different programs. I'll just go into a little bit more detail about 2 specific examples. One is implementation of the Garcia River TMDL. So this is a fairly well-known and was fairly controversial TMDL created for a river about halfway up the coast. And implementation of this particular TMDL involves general limits on discharges and a range of different compliance options that run a sort of spectrum from generalized standardized requirements to much more site-specific requirements that are going to take longer to develop, but that can be more tailored to a particular property. And compliance with these measures is primarily through BMPs. And this is widely seen, not just by agency staff, but also by environmental advocates in the region as a big success. Conditions in the river have, I'm going to go back one. Conditions in the river have improved significantly. Fish populations seem to be going up, even in spite of the drought, and massive amounts of sediment kept out of the river. So this is an example of non-point source regulation that actually does something for water quality. The other example I'll just briefly highlight is a dairy program that again includes general prohibitions on waste discharges from dairies. Those are subject to exemptions, but the exemptions come with all sorts of conditions, and the conditions generally require implementation of BMPs and also require notice of intent to comply, monitoring, reporting. So it's a structure, again, somewhat similar to what you might see for industrial stormwater permitting in the very general organization of the regulatory program. So again, these are just 2 examples, and I'll talk now about some of the lessons that I drew. And I should say that the research here involved both looking at the paper records, but also doing a series of interviews with people who were involved in this regulatory program or these regulatory programs, both on the government side, the nonprofit side, and also regulated entities. And a couple of conclusions came out of that, or more than a couple. I'll give you a list here. So the first is that non-point source regulation is possible. And in California, this is something I think we realize, but in many parts of the country, this has just seemed like the impossible dream from an environmental advocate's threat or the unlikely nightmare from the perspective of some regulated entities. But in California, we're actually doing it. And in some parts of the state, we are moving towards fairly comprehensive programs rather than programs that just focus on one specific river or one specific type of activity. Second lesson that was interesting is that the Clean Water Act has provided useful starting points for motivated regulators to do something about non-point source pollution. And this is interesting because the conventional wisdom in academic and I think activist circles has been that the Clean Water Act is kind of a failure with respect to non-point sources. And yet many of the different regulatory programs that the North Coast Board has pursued start in some way with a Clean Water Act requirement, whether it's preparing TMDLs or using Section 401 certifications, or a provision I never really knew much about before starting this research, Section 1323, which gives the state authority over water quality affecting activities on federal lands. So a lot of it starts with the Clean Water Act. A third interesting lesson is that a lot of non-point source regulation doesn't require completely reinventing the wheel. A lot of the measures that California has used, more specifically the North Coast Board has used, derive from, or at least analogous to, regulatory structures that we already use under the Clean Water Act. And that's true both for the specific permitting mechanisms and also for the kinds of state and local relationships that we see. which are in some ways a lot like cooperative federalism, but reproduced at a state and local level. And also BMPs, I think, are familiar to many of you in other settings, particularly if you're used to dealing with urban stormwater or industrial stormwater. And the BMPs that we're often using here in agricultural and forestry settings, they're not rocket science. They're not particularly complicated. And so they don't require the development of sophisticated new technology. That said, another very clear lesson is that it's hard to do this. Non-point source regulation is really challenging. There are a range of different challenges, and among the biggest are the geographic dispersion of sources, particularly over a huge area like the North Coast region that has a relatively sparse population and a relatively small agency staff overseeing it. And another big challenge is that it's hard to monitor effectiveness. It's not as easy to see the benefits as it might be where you just shut off a pipe that previously was discharging some sort of nasty effluent into a river. So it's harder to tell where the payoff is. And it's particularly true where you're dealing both with the impacts of present practices and also with really long-lasting legacy effects of past land management activities. Lesson 5 is if you want to do effective water quality protection, it's not just about the Clean Water Act and Porter-Cologne. So these regulatory programs are highly integrated with forestry regulation, with regulation of water rights, and also in some cases with active efforts to restore and to acquire and protect landscapes. So here you see an example of the Garcia River. Is the Garcia River watershed recovering because of TMDL implementation or because a huge piece of the land was bought and placed into conservation status? Although it is still a working landscape, there is still some timber harvesting going on there. It's hard to know. And that's challenging for people on all sides. It's challenging for regulated industry, which wants clarity about whether its obligations are really worth it and are paying off. And it's challenging for regulators as well. Lesson 6, I think this is the most important lesson of this particular study, is that it is not an on-off switch with non-point source regulation. And in a variety of different ways in the North Coast, and I think this is true in other parts of California as well, non-point source regulation is something that can be gradually phased in. And so often regulators will start by establishing a program that regulates with a really pretty light touch, and probably honestly not all that effectively in terms of actually producing water quality benefits. But what they are doing is building familiarity with the regulatory program, getting experience, building relationships with regulated entities, and setting things up for the next permit cycle to be somewhat more demanding. And I think this is an important lesson for the rest of the state and for other parts of the country, because it suggests that regulation, rather than being this massive hill you have to climb or cliff that you have to climb all at once, can be something that evolves through iterative processes and with a lot of dialogue with regulated entities, and that can become more effective in that way. So again, the upshot of all of this, I think, is that if you regulate traditional point sources, if that's your focus, obviously this isn't going to directly regulate you, but it means that the broader effort to achieve water quality is starting to encompass, at least in the state of California, and particularly in the North Coast, entities that traditionally were outside of the regulatory system and that created burdens for you. And I think that is a trend that if you represent NPDES regulated sources, I think it's a trend you should welcome. So that's the end of the talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Dave. We appreciate that. If anybody has questions for Dave, you can stick those in the Q&A link. That would be awesome. So we're going to try to go back to Adam now. Hopefully his internet is stable and we can hear from him.
Yes, I hope so. And so sorry about that. Yeah, we're having some internet issues, the troubles with the modern age, but hopefully I can do that. And I'm going to leave my camera off just in case it's a bandwidth thing for now. So I think, and thank you for being accommodating, Dave and Melissa. I really appreciate it. I was starting to talk about kind of the past, present, and future of the Clean Water Act and going into the value of the past and some of the great things that have been done over the last 50 years or so. and emphasizing the real value of the financial investment and partnership that was part of the first 20, 30 years of the Clean Water Act, and how that really facilitated the move from primary to secondary treatment almost across the board, which was a massive improvement to water quality. I think that was probably one of the biggest contributions overall of the Clean Water Act. I think the other one was just establishing a framework for regulation of known constituents and focusing primarily on point source discharges, which were significant at that time. And also the fact that it included things like pretreatment and source control and identifying where contaminants were coming from. I think that was very forward thinking. And I think it's almost hard to imagine now, but it really brought this structure of accountability and predictability for dischargers, regulators, and the public that didn't really exist in that time. And so it was really a huge step forward. I think made some massive gains in terms of water quality, protecting public health and the environment. And so I didn't really want anything I'm about to say next to undercut or downplay those contributions. I'd say next slide, Alec. Yeah, and then comes the but though, right? So in the modern era, I think we need to take a look at some of the shortcomings of the Clean Water Act and how things have changed a little bit. And I think, it does suffer from some kind of structural ingrained shortcomings, and a few different examples that I just wanted to run through on that. The first that comes to mind is sort of the difficulty of using Clean Water Act structure to address emerging constituents that are widespread and not really easily managed through traditional treatment trains. And I'll give you a couple examples. PFAS and microplastics are probably the top two issues that we're dealing with now, and I think they fit into that mold. The common theme really is the ubiquity of societal use. So it's not really point source related, industry related, it is broad spread, it is societal. And then the continued broad introduction of those constituents through ongoing usage. So you contrast that with something like mercury, which is primarily from mining, legacy constituent, or something that you could deal with through dentistry and dental amalgam program. That's not something you're going to be able to do with PFAS and microplastics. So I just, the Clean Water Act was designed to deal kind of better with the latter as opposed to the former. And I'd also like to say it's not that the CWA doesn't account for these things. There's obviously pretreatment requirements, there's obligations, there's liability and other types of statutes. And there are ways that we're looking at things, if you look at microplastic coming primarily from macroplastics, there's things like trash TMDLs and the like. But the reality is these are kind of broad scale and societal in nature. And the Clean Water Act structure operates under the assumption that there's a known contaminant, that it's harmful in a specified quantity, and that some treatment is available at a specific endpoint to address that contaminant. And that prevents end uses from being impaired in a water body. And, as I described that structure, it doesn't sound really like any modern water quality problem that I've worked on in the last 10 years. That's just not where the issues are coming from. So second, I think the CWA doesn't account well for big shifts in the environment that have been brought about by climate change. And really, I mean, that's not a criticism, that's fair. I don't think a ton of people were thinking about terms like climate resiliency back in the early 1970s, but today it's all we talk about. It's a huge, massive consideration. And I think I'll give you a couple examples of how that interacts with the Clean Water Act and how it impacts dischargers. The first being something like ocean acidification, where you can look at that and you say the overwhelming vast majority of issues stem from things like aerial deposition and carbon in the atmosphere and hitting the ocean. And yet the structure of the Act is focused on very minute contributions from point sources. And that's just because that's what it's intended to focus on. That's what it's able to control. And that doesn't mean it does the best for the overall picture, but that's the design. The other example I'd give is something like temperature and flow. So, we can model it out, but who knows what temperature is going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years? Who knows what the cycles of drought are going to look like? We do know they're going to be different, and we do know they're going to be dramatic. We just don't know what. And so, how do you put things into point source permits that are designed to account for these when things are changing so rapidly and so dramatically in the surrounding environment? The other part of that is sort of reconciling this need and this push for recycled water in places like California and the arid West, but recognizing that things like flows might be needed because drought conditions exist, universally. And so how do you balance those considerations? The Clean Water Act doesn't really address those in a specific and thorough way. I think the third one, and I think Dave mentioned this a little bit in this program, but is that, the Clean Water Act is still too focused narrowly on permit limits, quantities, and not necessarily on outcomes. I'd use the example, I was at a bacteria summit hosted by CASPA a few weeks ago, and we had these small group sessions. And I think what was clear was, different concerns, different approaches, but there just seemed to be this disconnect between actions that people are taking that are required to meet a specific permit or metric, and the actual results that you're trying to achieve through mitigating certain risks. And a couple examples that popped up there. One that I enjoyed from a gentleman was there was a lagoon that was a discharge point for someone, and they were having some bacteria issues, but it was surrounded by hundreds of geese all the time, and that was most likely the source of the contamination. And so is it the role of a point source discharge regulator in the Clean Water Act to do goose mitigation, to scare the goose away, to do something like that? I mean, we had a discussion about that, but those are the kind of problems that folks are dealing with modernly, and it just isn't a great fit with how the Clean Water Act is structured. The other part of that is just that, the expectations that come from point source discharges and trying to find ways to efficiently use our resources. There are some water bodies, that are just concrete line channels, and they have all these issues, and yet sometimes we can treat them the same way as pristine water bodies. And how do we bring some flexibility and nuance into the way we regulate things? And again, there is some flexibility under the Clean Water Act to do that, but it wasn't really designed in that way to allow us to be realistic in our expectations, especially in an environment of really limited resources. And the last kind of shortcoming in the present of the Clean Water Act that I wanted to mention is I think it creates some misperceptions about water quality and all of the dramatic improvements that have been made over the last 50 years. Things like 303D listings and TMDL systems, they list all these water bodies of impairment. And so when you just look at it superficially, you think, oh my gosh, things are not going well, water quality is not improving, there's all these listings. The reality is we have made huge improvements over the last 50 years. We are 90% of the way to our goal. And I think the Clean Water Act, just the way it's used and the way we use it in describing our water bodies, doesn't really help convey that message of large scale improvement, which has really done a really good job. So next slide, please, Alec. Thank you. And so those are some of the thoughts about what it is now. But the big question is, what can we do about that? How do we modernize the Clean Water Act? How do we address some of these issues and bring it into the 21st century? There's obviously no way politically or practically to do a full rewrite and approach things differently. But I think there are some flexibilities built in that, if expanded, if interpreted the right way, really might help us achieve what we want to achieve. I think the biggest one doesn't require any modifications really, and that's funding. We need to return to a strong federal and state funding model that was really the biggest success in the early years of the Clean Water Act. Now, I know Nicole ran through some of the money that's come in lately from the IIJA, state funds. All these recent infusions have been a good start, but the reality is the SRF is still oversubscribed. There are more projects than there is money to go around. Federal grants are in pretty short supply. And, these are all essentially one-time monies. What we really need is an ongoing long-term partnership, infusion of money and partnership from the federal level that just hasn't really existed over the last 10 or 15 years. And this, this may be one of the reasons why it seems like progress has stalled on a number of fronts. Second, I think we really need to look at expanding the flexibilities that are built into the Clean Water Act, things like trading systems, things like using innovative environmental solutions, regional partnerships, a lot of site-specific decision-making. The idea and theme of all those approaches, if you wanted to combine them, is we should be focusing on end goals. And I think too often the Clean Water Act is focused on end-of-pipe compliance with specific known constituents, and that isn't the same thing as focusing on end goal of maximizing improvement of water quality and the environment. I think the CWA framework, if interpreted strictly, it tends to disincentivize taking risks, using that flexibility, going outside the box to produce better outcomes than you would if you just follow the strict letter of interpretation. I think I'd give a couple good examples of things that folks have done. A group called the Freshwater Trust has done some work up in Oregon with temperature trading that I think was good. One of CASA's member agencies, Orloma Sand District, had a horizontal levee project that they've been working on since I started at CASA in the pilot phase. And I think that's a really innovative way to approach their treatment issues. I think the way that Sac Regional and their Harvest Water project was able to quantify a lot of the multiple benefits of reusing their water and treating it to a certain level. I think that's pretty innovative, but we need a lot more of those, and we need those types of things to be the norm as opposed to the exception when we look at Clean Water Act compliance. I think the third one, we need to be a little more realistic and focus on achievable outcomes, given that there are resource constraints and there are these issues that have broader societal impact. These are collective problems, these are societal problems, and we're trying to find ways to reduce inputs of the system through legislation, regulation, pretreatment. But I think all those issues of PFAS, microplastics, climate change, they fit into that mold of problems that don't neatly fit into point source solutions. And the last one, and this is, I think, primarily what Dave's presentation focused on, but Clean Water Act has a focus almost exclusively on point source pollution and does have some ancillary treatment of non-point sources. Now, that is a little different in California through the use of waste discharge requirements and other mechanisms. I think we do a lot more and have a lot more emphasis on it. But, state by state, this is not necessarily true across the country, and not all states regulate non-point sources in the same way we do. So to this point, the Clean Water Act has dealt very, very well with point sources. I think it's probably time to create a more concerted, broader approach that incorporates all the sources of contamination. So I will end my presentation. I'll just kind of a silly football analogy, but it feels like, for me, we're kind of in the red zone of clean water. So Clean Water Act has done really tough work of getting us 80%, 90% of the way there. But anybody who watches football knows you need a totally different playbook for that last 10 or 15 yards. It's very different. And so I think if we can all start to acknowledge where we're at with that, better utilize some of the flexibilities in the Act and expand on those in the way we approach clean water, it might just get us there. So thanks very much, Melissa and everyone. Happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you. Again, a reminder to put questions in the questions and answer. We have people answering them online, typing in answers, so people can take a look at that as we go along too. And next we are moving on to Nicole Granquist, who's going to talk a little bit about enforcement trends that we're seeing in the state.
Great, thank you. So the previous presenters have been speaking about sort of broad Clean Water Act principles in terms of, what's been gained, where do we still need to go, how is the interplay between the Clean Water Act and other statutes come into play when we're dealing with things like non-point source pollution. And my presentation is going to focus a little bit more narrowly on everyone's favorite topic of enforcement under the Clean Water Act. We're going to talk about trends where we're seeing both federal and state administrations sort of focusing their efforts in hopes that that will give folks a way to pinpoint what they should be thinking about so as to hopefully avoid enforcement in the future. And then talking about some practical tips to think about with respect to your operations. And then we'll go on to some what I'll call frequently asked questions that most technical staff ask lawyers whenever they get them in a room to talk about enforcement. So I'll try my best to answer them and hopefully answer other questions as well. Next slide. So as folks obviously know, we've been going through at the federal level under the Clean Water Act a bit of ping pong when it comes to the administrations that have been administering and implementing the Clean Water Act, and what I would say is probably their vastly different takes on what we should be doing under the Clean Water Act. So obviously we are now under the Biden administration, and that administration has been ushering in an era of increased enforcement. But that increased enforcement isn't just sort of generally just increase enforcement. They've really been focusing on a couple of different topics, and I think it's good for folks to understand that so they can assess whether or not they're in a geographic region or have folks who might be impacted disproportionately and know that they may be subject to a higher scrutiny level. So just this year alone, there's obviously a lot of things that have been going on in the Clean Water Act that I won't touch upon today in terms of, what's the waters of the US, and which is something we could probably talk for 4 or 5 hours about. There are a lot of activities under the Clean Water Act going on at a regulatory level, but at an enforcement level this year, President Biden proposed his budget for 2023, and it highlights that the enforcement priorities for the coming year signals that they are going to continue to ramp up enforcement and regulatory actions, and that will continue from last year, and it actually increases year over year. So we're seeing an increase in those budgetary amounts, which means more staff, more folks who are going to be paying attention to that. And then this May, a lot of what the focus has been for the Biden administration has really been on environmental justice. And that's something that can be, I think, sometimes difficult for, an everyday person running a treatment plant. What does this mean for me? But we've got to talk about what does that mean? And so there's a significant push towards focusing both permitting, regulatory, and also enforcement actions on areas where there is a concern about environmental justice. So the Office of Environmental Justice was launched, and they are putting together an enforcement strategy to guide enforcement priorities. And just a week and a half ago, there was a new national program office announced, the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, which covers all EPA regions, including the region that obviously we're subject to, which is EPA Region 9, and will be supported by more than 200 staff to really put an emphasis on environmental justice. So what does that mean for folks from a Clean Water Act permitting and enforcement standpoint? I think it's important for folks to assess where their operations are. Are they placed in disadvantaged communities? Are there discharges or other byproducts of your operations that might disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities? And if so, take a real hard look as to your operations in terms of how things are being done, how records are being kept, whether or not there could be improvements that could see some, an actual real world impact to improved, sort of lives in these communities. That's something that from a very programmatic level would be important, especially for public agencies as folks are going to boards and asking for money for, various activities. One of the things to think about is to really look at your service areas and to say, are disadvantaged communities being disproportionately impacted? How does my operations and compliance might play into that, and take a hard look, because it seems as though the federal and state administrations will be doing the same. California is sort of following suit on the increased enforcement. We don't have the formal numbers for 2021, 2022 yet from the State Water Board, so that's why we're using 2020 and 2021 as our latest. But we did see a slight increase over the previous year in the number of formal penalty enforcement actions taken in the NPDES wastewater program, so justice program. And of the 105 penalty actions that were related to that program, 92 of those were in regions 2, 4, and 5. So that's San Francisco, Los Angeles, Central Valley, obviously where there's a lot of population centers. Doesn't mean there aren't some significant enforcement actions happening in other regions, but if you are in that region, understand that obviously there is an increased emphasis on enforcement. And then there is recent legislation that was just adopted into law this last month, talking about the same issue on environmental justice as the federal government is contending with. This one is focused more on permitting actions, but that, of course, whatever's in your permit will lead to enforcement later. And AB 2108 requires there to be environmental justice sort of findings and reviews when permits are being adopted. And that's why I sort of recommend that folks really do think about the service areas and think about how to present their operations and how to present information to the state, because you're going to get asked these questions when permitting renewals come up is sort of what are you doing to ensure that there's sort of a level playing field of environmental impacts. So these are things to be sort of big picture knowledgeable about in terms of enforcement and permitting trends. And now we'll dive into a few more specifics. Next slide. So just to get everybody quickly up to speed, I won't go over all of these, to have a true discussion, a robust discussion about enforcement under the Clean Water Act, you would probably listen to me yammer on for hours. So I've just picked sort of one corner of the world, but I do want everyone, as we go into that corner of the world in the next few slides, to have sort of the same understanding as when we talk about enforcement orders, what does that mean? Because it means a lot of different things, and they all have their reasons for being, but also their strategies for dealing with them. And so enforcement actions can be compliance orders, like time schedule orders, cease and desist orders, and cleanup and abatement orders. Those are administratively issued to bring somebody into compliance. And then there's administrative civil liability orders, which are orders that are adopted that can contain monetary penalties, whether or not they're mandatory minimum penalties or discretionary penalties. And sometimes those orders can also include prospective compliance requirements in terms of bringing a discharger back into compliance. Then there's judicial enforcement that's brought by the California Attorney General's office on behalf of the state water board and the regional water boards. And that comes up in cases where either there's something high profile or the regional water boards feel as though it's maybe too difficult or significant to take on an administrative action. They'll refer it to the AG's office. And then, of course, there are third-party citizen suits, which hopefully a lot of you haven't been subjected to, but probably many of you have. And one thing I want to just sort of make sure folks realize in the third-party citizen suit world is most folks, they'll go to the statutes. They'll, look on the internet or open the book and say, what are the penalties under the Clean Water Act if I receive a third-party citizen suit? And most folks will say, oh, the statute says it's $25,000 a day per violation. One thing just to make sure that you are aware of, especially as you're assessing your own risks and talking to your own boards about, what are the penalties for noncompliance, is that per day penalty in the Clean Water Act is actually periodically adjusted through a rule that's published in the Federal Register called the Civil Monetary Penalty Inflation Adjustment Rule. And that last adjustment occurred in early 2022. And so that $25,000 a day that's prescribed in statute is actually now $59,973 per day per violation. Last year, I think it was December of 2021, it was 56,460. So as you can see, because of the inflation that we're all experiencing generally in all aspects of our lives, we're starting to see an almost annual increase in the penalties that can be assessed under the Clean Water Act. It used to be that these only got modified every 5 or 10 years. And recently it's been every couple of years that we've seen a jump. So it is almost $60,000 per violation per day. So as you can imagine, that does add up quickly. Next slide. So what are we seeing? No surprise, based on the inflationary concepts that we just talked about. What are we seeing in terms of enforcement? Well, what we're seeing is a significant increase in the dollar amounts for ACL penalties and judicial settlements. So, back in the day, which may just qualify as 5 years ago, there was usually an assumption that if there was noncompliance that wasn't severe, significant, perhaps a spill, an unauthorized discharge, something that happened that of course was unintended but wouldn't necessarily reflect bad operations, but mistakes happen, human error, things break, things leak. The assumption was that you might be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of a penalty, maybe even in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars. And those times have really changed. The monetary penalties are going up significantly. All you have to do is go to the state water board or any of the regional water boards website and click on, they all have, enforcement bars where you can kind of see what enforcement actions are being taken. And you'll see the numbers are getting to be in the high hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, more routinely than has been in the past. That's not to say that there aren't discretionary enforcement actions that aren't still $100,000 or $200,000, but they are becoming fewer and farther between. Now, that is separate than mandatory minimum penalties, which apply to exceedances where you have a numeric absolute limitation, you exceed it and you pay maybe a $3,000 penalty. What we're talking about here is discretionary enforcement, where the regional water board will take an individual action from a discretionary enforcement standpoint. So we are really seeing those increases. Part of that is overall inflation, the increase in the authorized penalty amounts. Some of it is the purpose of enforcement to be a deterrent and to be a punishment. There's been, I think, a bit of a change in terms of really trying to hone in on those deterrent and punishment sort of factors in an effort to try to use ACL orders as a chilling effect for anybody else who might think they can sort of do the same thing and not have to pay a strict penalty. One of the other issues is economic benefit. The cost, excuse me, the cost for compliance activities is increasing in terms of how much it costs in order to comply. And in an ACL order where you have a discharge to a waters of the US, which are many of the discharge orders, to a creek, stream, et cetera, the water boards have to recover economic benefit. And so they'll go through a whole process working with the discharger to say, what would it have taken for you to come into compliance? How much would have that cost? And then the water boards have to take the sort of discretionary action as to quantifying what economic benefit was, and they must recoup that as part of a penalty action. So there's a variety of factors that drive penalties under the state's enforcement policy. There's harm, how much you've deviated from the permit. There's per gallon and per day assessments, and discharger conduct. Anybody who's been through an ACL negotiation knows that there's a lot packed behind those words under the enforcement policy, and a lot of math with spreadsheets that the state uses. But these are the kind of things to think about as folks are moving through your sort of day-to-day life from a compliance standpoint, is understanding penalties are high. And while costs of compliance and costs to build things and to rectify circumstances, even if they're minor, can be high, it really does behoove you to spend the money on compliance rather than penalties, because then unfortunately you have to pay for both. And then supplemental environmental projects is another thing that I just wanted to quickly highlight. We're finding in enforcement actions, obviously, as the dollar value goes up in an enforcement action, more and more folks want to be able to put that money towards a local project, something that will at least benefit the community, who, especially with public agencies, that it's ratepayer money. And so you want to put some money back into the local environment if you can. And I think the state water board and regional water board have been quite receptive to good projects. I've been able to negotiate them, but what we are finding is that they're harder and harder to find, and it takes a long lead time in order to find them, develop them, and create them into the type of project that can be acceptable under the state's supplemental environmental projects policies. And so one thing to also note, not that everybody has a bunch of time in their day to do this, but really start to think about projects in your region. Try to make sure that lines of communication are open between groups who might be doing these projects, so that to the extent you find yourself in the unfortunate circumstance of having an enforcement action and having to think about a supplemental environmental project, that you've maybe given some thought to your region as to where that might be and have a bit of a leg up. Or else sometimes the state's own lists of acceptable steps are a little scant on the projects that folks might want to do because it may not be in their geographic region. That those lists are not as robust as we'd all like them to be. I know the state would like them to be too, but it's a matter of time and resources and staff to be able to devote to finding all those projects. So really do think about what those types of projects might be when you can, so that you've got something that at least could be lined up in that circumstance. The other item, of course, is that third-party citizen suit activity is on the rise. We see it in a variety of sectors. Probably the sector that is most on the rise is industrial stormwater, which you'd think maybe this group of POTW folks wouldn't have to worry about. But a lot of public agencies hold industrial stormwater permits for a variety of facilities like landfills, MRFs, et cetera. Sometimes even the treatment plant itself, depending upon your layout. And so really focusing on ensuring that you understand the industrial stormwater permit, its requirements, and what needs to be done, especially if you can divert some of that stormwater to your sanitary sewer system in order to comply. These are the things to think about, because we've really seen a significant increase in third-party citizen suit activity. Next slide. Oh, and one thing also to note is when I was talking about the supplemental environmental project, the other item that if you're settling an enforcement action and that enforcement action happens to be a higher dollar value, you can also devote some of the money to enhanced compliance projects, which would be something that is over and above what you might be required to do from a compliance standpoint, but you would be able to spend that money sort of on upgrading your own facility for your own ratepayers' benefit. And those projects can be very valuable. And in the heat of the moment, folks sometimes aren't able to come up with something quickly from an sort of an enhanced compliance action. And that I would also sort of put on the list of, to the extent folks start talking about, gee, we could do this, but we're not required. And everybody sort of forgets about, well, we'd like to do that, but we don't have the resources to do it. Sort of put that on a potential enhanced compliance action list in the event that you're unfortunately having to deal with an enforcement action. So then I think what really folks, after listening to the amount of penalties that are being bandied about in enforcement actions, the amount of resources, time, effort it takes, and of course some perception issues and publicity and all of that, everybody would like to avoid enforcement. And so rather than sort of give a presentation that just sort of focuses on one aspect of monetary enforcement or something that I know comes up a lot, but will be just one little corner of the enforcement world, I thought maybe the best way to reach a lot of folks with useful information is to really talk about how do you avoid enforcement to begin with, rather than getting into a lot of nitty-gritty details about specific enforcement actions. And so I thought this might be the most helpful thing for this group to talk about, especially when we're talking about the Clean Water Act at 50, and what the Clean Water Act is really trying to do. A lot of these tasks, I think, sort of fall in line with that, which is to really understand your permits. That is key. What we find time and time again is folks who understand their numeric effluent limitations in their permits, but they may not really understand the meaning of a lot of those narrative provisions in their permits, discharge prohibitions, receiving water limitations, duplicative requirements. That's really important. Spend time with water board staff on these items. The next item is training. I'll give a great example of the sanitary sewer system WDR. That's going to require significant training when it comes out. I try to avoid within your agency sort of this is how it's always been done. Really do spend the time on training and getting to know new requirements. It will save you some effort. Because even if the state has a reasonable enforcement response on, say, the SSS WDR, third parties like to use that permit as part of a Clean Water Act action, using your MPDS permit and using any non-compliance with the SSS WDR as just a way to sort of get in the door. Make sure you pay attention to laboratory and reporting issues. One thing that sometimes folks don't realize is when you get a lab result and you report that, under the case law in the Ninth Circuit, you are not allowed to change that result, even if it was wrong from a third-party citizen suit or an enforcement standpoint. So it's really important to pay attention to your lab issues. If you get a funny result, don't just report it. Make sure that you report it with caveats and asterisks. Whatever you do, make sure you put whatever information in that will give you an argument later in enforcement that, hey, that wasn't right. Next slide. Think about preparedness and redundancy. Just 2 months ago, East Bay Mud agreed to a ACL order of $816,000 because they ran out of a chemical used to remove chlorine prior to discharge. So you can see that was a costly error. Really try to pay attention to preparedness or redundancy. We all know there's supply chain issues right now. If you run into something, try to work with your water board staff before it gets to a penalty of almost $1 million. Address your aging infrastructure, be proactive, because what happens when you're not proactive on aging infrastructure is then you have to pay a penalty and still fix that infrastructure, and usually on a quicker time frame, which can be more expensive from a ratepayer standpoint in terms of capital that you need to amass quickly. Avoid prolonged response to non-compliance. Usually what happens is, especially for what I'll call sort of lower level non-compliance, it's easy to get caught up with other things and let certain things go on a longer time frame than will look good to an agency at the end of the day. I'm dealing with an EPA enforcement action right now. That's the example right here, because there was a software glitch and it's taken them years to fix it. And so EPA got upset that it took so long, even though it's not a huge significant issue. And now they're having to pay penalties for that. So make sure to really sort of stay on task if you've got a non-compliance issue, even if it seems minor. And then perform compliance audits. Although it's an initial investment, compliance audits can really help illuminate issues, especially if you have an on-site laboratory. We have clients who have done that with their laboratories and found issues that they were able to correct and avoid a future enforcement action. Next slide, which I think is my final slide. So I'm going to lay these out. I'm not going to necessarily, I want to be cognizant that it's 12:15, and I'll touch on maybe the first two items here, and then to the extent there's questions that key off some of these questions, we can talk about it during our question and answer session. Or if you want to ask other questions, certainly of any of the panelists, feel free. But there's a couple of items that folks always ask. It seems like, how far back can the water board go in an administrative agency enforcement? And until more recently, there's actually a case that sort of finally decided this. It used to feel like there was really no statute of limitations on an administrative agency enforcement action, which is separate than a judicial enforcement action by the AG's office, where they're limited to 3 years. And there was actually a recent case that said that from an administrative standpoint, the regional water board needs to respect that same time frame from a statute of limitations. So I think we are making some strides in sort of at least putting reasonable time frame bounds on the regional water boards as to how far back they can go, so that 20 years later you're not looking at an enforcement action for something that has long been sort of since resolved. So now a good rule of thumb is 3 years plus or minus. And then the other item that I just want to touch on, because a lot of folks always have this question, is does a time schedule order or a cease and desist order protect me from other enforcement, such as a third-party citizen suit? And the answer is no. So a lot of times we talk to clients and they say, well, I got a time schedule order, so how did I get this third-party citizen suit? And folks should just understand that those orders are separate from your permit. A third-party citizen suit enforces the terms of your permit. Those orders are issued outside of your permit. So it provides protection as to what the state is going to do in terms of its own enforcement action, but it does not provide any protection against third-party citizen suits unless they are a very specific type of order with lots of different requirements that would take another half hour to talk about, so I won't. But generally speaking, you should know time schedule orders and cease and desist orders are helpful with the state, but they do not provide you any protection with respect to third-party citizen suits. So with that, being cognizant of my time, I will end my presentation and we can open up to questions from the group.
Okay, so we have some questions. Many of them have been answered already in the question and answer part of the little button that you have down at the bottom. But we had a question about, although we've made strides in the last 50 years, they believe that we have yet to meet the goals of making all navigable waters fishable and swimmable. Does the panel believe that we will meet this goal in the next 50 years? Are we on target, or does a strong paradigm shift in our relationship with water still need to happen? I think some people talked about this in their presentations. And I think, it's going to depend on every single water body, because some are much better off than others. Does anyone want to tap into that question? Nicole, maybe? Morgan?
I think, it was fairly well touched on within the other presentations. Just, as we move forward over this next 50 years, one thing to do is learn from our past, and we're going to have to adapt as we move forward through this next 50. Because it's really interesting, because I think I'm the only engineer perhaps on the panel, but it's as an engineer, we usually we take and we learn from that past, and we use it to forecast what that future is. The one thing that's happening right now is climate change. So it's changing what that future looks like. And so not only to learn from that past, but also we're going to have to adapt. And so, there are things that we've made great strides towards, and we're moving towards that goal. I think there's areas of the state where we've done a really good job, and we really have come a long way. There are other places where we're going to have to adapt, and we're going to have to learn, and we're going to have to, look at things differently. And we're going to have to make some adjustments of how we approach our regulations in the future. And part of that is the ever-changing climate, and part of it is that we have come such a long way over the past 50 years to where we now have to continue to adapt in order to make those achievements in the future. Look at things holistically and look at the watershed as a whole. So it's, I'm hopeful for the next 50 years, especially with, this group of leaders here and other leaders throughout the state, that we can continue to collaborate, and we can continue to adjust and make those changes that we need to achieve the goal within the next 50 years.
Thank you, Nicole. So another one of the questions was the case that was being referred to about limitations on enforcement. So that was the Malaga versus State Water Resource Control Board case. So historically, the state board and regional boards had gone back in time up to 10 years or more to enforce penalties. And that case raised the issue of latches, which is an equitable defense under the Clean Water, or under the law. And the State Water Board had never really recognized latches previously. And now in that case, if it's more than 3 years, then it's presumed that there's prejudice to the discharger, and it shifts the burden to the State Water Board to show that there is no prejudice from taking that enforcement action late. So there was a question, and that was about Nicole Granquist. What do you believe the sanitary sewer WDR will do to third-party litigation following the new readoption?
Well, I think, and I'll, Adam can chime in as well, because I know he's been working on it even more closely than me. I think because of its detail, it's always hard, because I think that the State Water Board staff has good intentions in terms of, and I know Nicole Morgan has been working on that document as well, so she can chime in as well. I think we've got a program where the State Water Board staff wants a number of additional tasks, more information, more reporting, just a lot more detail that agencies are going to have to keep track of, report, et cetera. And then a lot of actions that previously were not, some agencies may have undertaken, but previously weren't necessarily an actual requirement. So from my perspective, when it comes to just sort of us and the state, I wouldn't be necessarily as concerned about the document and all of its detail, because I think we've got pretty good relationships with the state on this WDR, and I think enforcement has been reasonable by the state with respect to that document. What happens, unfortunately, and what we really tried to make clear, and I know and I appreciate Nicole's help on this, is that every term under the SSS WDR, no matter how minor, if an agency doesn't comply or has a late report or is doing something in a slightly different way, the third parties use it as a whole laundry list of allegations in third-party citizen suits. So what they'll do is, if you have a couple of spills, they will use your NPDES permit to say, gee, you're in violation of your NPDES permit, and they act assuming that, it got to waters. But then what they'll do in order to sort of force settlement terms, or I hate to say it, increase attorney's fees, et cetera, they'll list out every single thing under that SSS WDR that they think, and they have a different interpretation of the term, that they think you had to do, and will sort of force, in our experience, try to force actions that aren't even required by the SSS WDR as part of settlement of that third-party citizen suit. So it sort of creates this additional layer of regulation that really isn't even in the WDR, but they'll take leaps from that WDR. So I would say that the new version is a lot more detailed. It has a lot more items that third parties can use for that purpose. And so I don't believe that it's the state's intention at all to sort of put us in that situation. The detail they want, I understand they want for their own program, but the natural effect of it will be that I think what we'll see in third-party citizen suits on sanitary sewer overflows is a lot more detail-oriented list of things that we should have done under that WDR, new settlement terms that they want to see as a result of that WDR. So although they can't enforce that WDR directly under the Clean Water Act, it is frequently used if you've got a spill that exits your collection system and you've got that MPDES hook. So I do think we're going to see a lot of discussion of that SSWDR within the context of resolving third-party citizen suits. And Adam or Nicole, if you have something to add, feel free.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm still having some internet issues here, so I'm joining by phone. But yeah, I think that it might bridge with the next question that I saw on there as well, which is the trainings that are upcoming. So obviously, we're still working to look at what the final draft of the WDR is going to look like, but I think it's going in a very good direction. So everything Nicole said about, working with us, there will be more requirements, but at least there's been some notice and we worked on it and sort of worked it into the way that it's structured at collection agencies right now. So really, I wouldn't worry as much about that, but certainly we will be having a couple trainings. I know at least initially CASA is planning one to run through all the changes from the existing WDR into the new one to get all of our agencies ready and prepared. I know there will be a little bit of lag time for agencies to adjust because it'll take some time to do that. And then I think ongoing training, I would defer over to CWEA because they do a lot of the operator training and things like that. So we will do the initial cut because we work so closely on developing the WDR, but then for the long-term future training, I think CWEA will be offering a number of things to make sure folks stay in compliance.
I wanted to pull Dave back into the conversation from the non-point source side, and he and I had a little offline conversation about what's going on in the Central Valley, because they, and actually the Central Coast, they've been reacting to lawsuits, threatened lawsuits or actual lawsuits under trespass and nuisance, where people are claiming their groundwater has been contaminated, which has driven some regulatory action. So a huge activity in the Central Valley is the CV Salts, which is a big collaboration from all stakeholders involved in dealing with nitrates and salt discharges. And, it's going to be a long time horizon, 50 years, 35 to 50 years to resolve some of these things. And it's beyond the Clean Water Act because it's dealing with groundwater in a lot of the ways. But I think there are other things that can be tacked into Clean Water Act enforcement that people are learning how to use those tools to get to non-point sources. And I think Dave wanted to also explain one of his answers that he had typed in.
So actually this may tie in a little bit to CV Salts and the Irrigated Lands Program in the Central Valley. One of the questions was, I'm going to forget the exact phrasing, but it was about multi-stakeholder collaborations and what role that type of work was playing in the regulatory efforts I was studying. And the answer is a huge role. As I talk to regulators, and again, also to regulated entity representatives about how these regulatory systems were evolving, on both sides, there was a big emphasis on outreach and dialogue. And sometimes outreach and dialogue occurring in places of the state where the political climate is exceedingly hostile to government regulation. And so what regulators talked about is essentially going onto people's land, walking around with them, talking with them. And of course, you had to start with the people who are willing to bring you onto their land, letting people vent and yell and be frustrated. And particular frustration is lack of coordination among state agencies, and then use that as the starting point of building a relationship. And I kind of knew, I know that we all know that regulation, if it's done well, there's a lot of craft to it, and there's a lot of patience and effort. What was interesting was hearing similar stories from ag representatives who were talking about, basically saying, look, the regulation is going to come, it's going to happen. So you have to build a coalition, you have to be in dialogue with each other, with the regulators for years. You have to worry about your own fringe members who won't talk, not just won't talk to the regulators, but won't even talk to you. And so it was impressive to me just how much effort was going in on all sides into thinking about how to build something through relationships with lots and lots of people involved.
Thanks, Dave. So we have a little video that we wanted to show you, and it is from the Northeast Ohio Regional SAN, and it has the voice of James Earl Jones, and that always reminds me of Darth Vader. So let the force be with us to clean up the water throughout the nation.
So the Cuyahoga always has been and must be a working river. We also want her for our pleasures, recreation, and as a thing of beauty. She has remained low profile through our lifetimes. Despite the tremendous industrial development, few events of memorable significance have taken place on her waters or on her banks. With all the clamor and din of mills, refineries, and factories, the river has gone about her business quietly and has been taken for granted. She received some publicity in 1936 when a spark from a blowtorch being used to dismantle a boat ignited floating waste, burning for 5 days. The fire was extinguished, and the river lapsed back into obscurity. But over 30 years later, in 1969, another fire, and the Cuyahoga, a relative unknown, became an overnight sensation. The pollution problem received national attention. Time magazine reported shortly after the incident, "Sun River, chocolate brown, oily, bubbling with subsurface gases. It oozes rather than flows. Anyone who falls into the Cuyahoga does not drown," Cleveland citizens joke grimly, "he decays." All joking aside, the situation was indeed grim. Pollution has been an intrinsic part of the river's history. It's a problem that could not be rectified overnight, but a problem that in recent years has been studied as a priority. So the Cuyahoga always...
So that we have come a long way, that shows us. So thank you everybody for attending. We have a couple of announcements to make about upcoming events. So if Alec could put those up for us. So we have the winter conference for CASA coming up in Palm Springs, which is always a nice place to go in January. So people should consider that. And then the pre-treatment conference for CWA also at the end of January in Monterey. And love to have you guys attend. And thank you everyone for coming. We went over a couple minutes, so we apologize for the technical difficulties that we had, but I think we muddled through and got it done. So thank you for joining us.